I built an underground shelter for about $1,000 that protects my family from both nuclear fallout and tornadoes. The reason it works has nothing to do with what I spent. It works because I put 3 feet of packed earth over our heads. That 3 feet of dirt blocks roughly 99% of gamma radiation from fallout. Whether that dirt sits on top of concrete, steel, or the lumber roof I framed myself makes no difference to the radiation. The earth does the blocking. The structure underneath just has to hold the weight and keep you dry enough to occupy the space. That is the part no one explains when they are selling you a $50,000 bunker. The same 3 feet of earth that stops radiation also puts you completely below ground level, which means tornado winds pass over you instead of through you. I dug a hole 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 7 feet deep. I framed a roof with dimensional lumber, covered it with plastic sheeting, and buried it under 3 feet of compacted soil. Total material cost was around $1,100. It took me 2.5 weeks of digging by hand. It has been in the ground for 6 years now, and it is still dry enough to store supplies and sleep in when we need to. The one thing the bunker salesman will never tell you is this: fallout protection comes from mass overhead, not from what is underneath. When I understood that, I realized every dollar I was about to spend on a commercial bunker was buying me nothing that dirt could not do for free. Gamma radiation loses energy as it passes through mass. Every few inches of packed soil cuts the radiation in half. 3 feet of packed earth gives you roughly 10 of those halving layers, which brings the radiation down to about 1% of what it was at the surface. That is physics. The dirt does not care if it is resting on a concrete vault or on plywood I bought at the lumber yard. The protection factor is the same. I learned this from civil defense publications that were printed in the 1960s and are still available for free. They state it plainly. A basement corner with dirt piled against the outside wall provides better protection than an expensive shelter with no earth cover. The expensive shelter gives you more comfort, cleaner air, better lighting, and space to stay longer. Those things matter. But the radiation blocking happens in the dirt, not in the steel. Once I understood that, I stopped looking at shelters and started looking at earth-moving tools. Before I moved a single shovel of dirt, I spent 2 weeks just looking at the land and talking to my neighbors about their wells. The water table will destroy this shelter faster than anything else, and once you have dug the hole, you cannot move it. I needed a spot where water drains away naturally, not toward the structure. I picked ground that slopes downhill away from the house. Rainwater runs off instead of pooling near the entrance. I stayed far from trees because tree roots will grow into the walls and tear through the plastic waterproofing within about 2 years. I have seen it happen. The roots do not care that you built something. I stayed at least 10 feet from the property line and never considered digging under or near the house foundation. Before I started, I asked 3 neighbors how deep their wells were. All of them said around 30 feet. That told me the water table was low enough to dig 7 feet down without hitting groundwater. If their wells had been 8 or 10 feet deep, I would have stopped right there. No amount of waterproofing fixes a hole dug below the water table in a build like this. You would need sump pumps, drainage systems, and a budget 10 times what I had. I also picked a spot out of view from the street. Not because I was hiding, but because I did not want to answer questions or draw attention. This was for my family, not for the neighborhood. Site selection is not about convenience, It is about whether the shelter will still be usable in 5 years or whether it will be a flooded, root-damaged hole you cannot enter. I dug an 8 by 10 hole 7 feet deep entirely by hand. That is 560 cubic feet of earth, which comes out to roughly 20 tons of soil. I moved all of it with a shovel, a pickaxe, a wheelbarrow, and 2 5-gallon buckets. It took me 2.5 weeks, working about 3 hours each day after work. I did not dig straight down. I went down in layers, 1 foot at a time, across the whole floor area. Digging straight down creates vertical walls that collapse. I learned that from reading trench safety guidelines, and I took it seriously because vertical earth walls at 6 feet deep can kill you if they let go while you are at the bottom. Every 2 feet down, I installed temporary bracing, 2 by 4 boards running horizontally across the width of the hole, held in place with vertical posts. That lumber cost me about $50, and it stayed in place until the roof was finished. It was not part of the final structure. It was insurance against burial. I kept the walls as vertical as I could while still bracing them, because sloping the walls at a safe angle would have tripled the digging. I did not have that much time. The dirt I pulled out went into a pile about 15 feet from the hole. I spread some of it across the yard, but I saved most of it because I knew I would need it later to cover the roof. By the end of the second week, I was standing at the bottom of a 7-foot hole, and the walls were still holding. That was the day I knew the rest of the build would work. The roof is just 2 by 10 lumber beams running across the 8-foot span, topped with plywood. But those beams are holding up 3 feet of packed earth, about 12 tons of weight. So I did not cut corners. I used 10 2 by 10 joists, spaced 16 inches on center, running the short direction across the hole. I set a 2 by 12 beam down the center, running the full 10-foot length, supported by 3 4 by 4 posts that bear directly on the floor. That center beam carries half the weight, so the joists do not sag. I laid 4 sheets of 3/4-inch plywood across the joists to spread the load evenly. The plywood cost me about $100. The joists, beam, and posts cost another $190. I did not use 2 by 8s. I did not use 2 by 6s. Those dimensions will not hold this load across an 8-foot span. I checked span tables and I stayed inside the safe range, because if that roof bows even 2 inches, the plastic sheeting on top develops low spots where water pools. Water sits there, seeps through any crack it finds, and rots the wood. Once the wood rots under 12 tons of saturated soil, the whole structure comes down. I have seen pictures of failed shelters where someone used undersized lumber or spaced the joists too far apart. The roof looks fine for 6 months, maybe a year, and then it gives way all at once. I built this to last 20 years, not 2. The lumber is not exotic. The design is not complicated. It is just dimensionally adequate for the load, installed with the spacing and support that keeps it from failing. I am not going to lie to you and say the shelter is perfectly dry because no underground structure built for $1,000 is watertight. But I can keep it dry enough to live in for days at a time, and that is what matters. Water kills these shelters in 2 ways. It rots the wood that holds up the roof, and it makes the space unusable. I dealt with both by accepting that some dampness is inevitable and building to manage it, not eliminate it. After the roof framing was done, I laid 6 mil plastic sheeting across the entire plywood surface. I used a single sheet, 10 feet by 20 feet, that cost me about $40. I draped it so it overhung the edges by at least 2 feet on all sides. Then I covered that with a layer of roofing felt for extra protection. Another $30. I did not tape the seams or try to make it airtight. I just overlapped the plastic and let the weight of the dirt hold it in place. Before I started piling soil back on top, I added a 6-inch layer of coarse gravel directly over the plastic. That gravel cost me about $50, and it serves as a drainage layer so water does not sit on the roof. It runs sideways through the gravel and off the edges instead of pooling. Then I added the dirt back, 3 feet of it, packed down in layers as I went. I wet it lightly and tamped it by walking on it, because loose dirt settles over time and creates dips that collect water. I shaped the top so it crowned slightly in the center and sloped away on all sides. That slope is subtle, maybe 3 or 4 inches of drop over 8 feet, but it is enough to move rainwater off instead of letting it sit. Inside, the walls are bare earth. I did not line them with plastic because I knew it would tear the first time I leaned a shelf against it or bumped it with a supply box. Bare earth sheds a little dust, and in wet weather it weeps moisture in a few spots, but it does not flood. The floor is gravel, leftover stone from the drainage layer, covered with a plastic tarp I replaced once after 3 years. I thought about pouring a concrete slab, and I still might someday, but for now the gravel drains well enough that standing water has never been a problem. This shelter is damp the way a root cellar is damp. It smells like earth. Cardboard left on the shelves will soften over months, but sleeping bags stay dry, stored food stays edible, and we can occupy the space for 72 hours without issue. That is manageable. That is enough. I ran 2 4-inch PVC pipes through the roof for air, one low as intake, one high as exhaust, because without airflow, carbon dioxide will build up and make that space dangerous in about 6 hours. I am not guessing about that. 2 adults breathing in a sealed 560 cubic foot space will push CO2 levels past safe limits faster than most people think. The ventilation system cost me $20 in materials, 2 10-foot sections of schedule, 40 PVC, 4 90-degree elbows, and a small roll of window screen mesh. I positioned the intake pipe near the floor at one end of the shelter and the exhaust pipe near the ceiling at the opposite end. Both pipes run straight up through the roof, penetrating the plywood and the plastic sheeting, and extend about 2 feet above the finished soil level. I sealed around the penetrations with roofing tar to keep water from running down the outside of the pipes and into the shelter. The 90-degree elbows at the top of each pipe point downward so rain does not pour directly in. I cut small squares of screen mesh and fixed them inside the elbows with zip ties to keep insects and rodents out. The system works by convection. Warm air rises through the exhaust while cooler air is pulled in through the intake. It is slow. On a still day, you can barely feel it. But it moves enough air to keep CO2 from building to dangerous levels, and that is the minimum requirement. I do not have filters. Real fallout filters cost hundreds of dollars, and homemade versions do almost nothing. During a radiation event, I would close both pipes for the first 48 hours when fallout intensity is highest, accept the CO2 discomfort, and reopen them once levels drop. That is not ideal. It is the reality of this budget. For the entrance, I dug a sloped trench at roughly a 45-degree angle, 3 feet wide, leading from ground level down to the shelter floor. I did not use a vertical ladder shaft, because a ladder means I cannot carry 5-gallon water jugs, a case of supplies, or an injured person in or out. The sloped entry added about 100 cubic feet to the total excavation, but it made the shelter usable in the situations where I would actually need it. I lined the trench walls with landscape timbers, which cost me around $60, and built steps from stacked 2x6 lumber, another $30. At the top, I installed a solid wood door I found used for $60. It is not a blast door. It is not airtight. It is an exterior grade door with 3 hinges and a sliding bolt latch, and it keeps weather out and provides a second barrier after you are inside. Ventilation and access are not optional. They are the 2 things that determine whether you can actually use this shelter or whether it is just a hole you spent money on. The interior is a plywood sleeping platform, a bucket toilet with a seat lid, battery LED lights, and shelves to keep our supplies off the floor. Nothing fancy, because this isn't a place to live, it's a place to survive. I built a sleeping platform from 2 sheets of half-inch plywood set across concrete blocks I already had. That cost me about $30 for the plywood. It's 40 inches off the floor, which keeps bedding away from any dampness that wicks up, and the space underneath stores water jugs and canned food. For sanitation, I use a 5-gallon bucket fitted with a snap-on toilet seat lid. The bucket cost me $8, the lid another $12. I line it with heavy trash bags that I tie off and remove after use. It is not pleasant. It works. For lighting, I mounted 2 battery-powered LED strip lights to the ceiling joists. Each one cost me about $15 and runs for 30 hours on 4D batteries. I keep spare batteries on the shelves in waterproof bags. The light is bright enough to see clearly, but not harsh. For storage, I built simple shelves from scrap 2x4, framing and 1/4-inch plywood, about $40 in materials. The shelves hold 3 days of water per person, canned goods, a battery radio, first aid supplies, and a hand crank flashlight. I added a folding cot I bought used for $25, which makes sleeping more comfortable than lying directly on the platform, though in an emergency, the platform itself is enough. The floor is covered with a plastic tarp that costs $10 and gets replaced every few years when it tears. There is no electricity beyond the battery lights. There is no heat source, no running water. There is no heat source because the earth around the shelter keeps it at a stable temperature year-round, about 55 degrees, which is cold but survivable with blankets. When I added up every receipt, the tools I didn't already own, the lumber, the plywood, the plastic sheeting, the gravel, the PVC, the door, the hardware, the finishing materials, I spent right around $1,100. Most of that was the roof. The joists, beam, posts, and plywood together ran close to $300. The waterproofing materials, plastic, roofing felt, gravel, added another $120. Ventilation was $20. The entry construction and door cost about $150. Interior finishing came to around $100. Fasteners, tar, miscellaneous hardware brought it up to the final total. That is what it actually cost. Not what I estimated it might cost, but what I paid. I built this with hand tools over a few weekends, using dirt that was already on my property, and the same principle that protects me, mass overhead, is what people relied on long before anyone started selling bunkers for $50,000. The protection factor is real. 3 feet of earth reduces gamma radiation by about 99%, and being underground takes you out of the path of tornado winds entirely. This shelter is not perfect. It is damp. It is dark. It is not a place I want to spend a week, but it is a place my family can survive in when we need to, and I built it for about what most people spend on a used car. The knowledge was not hidden. The materials were not exotic. The work was just digging, framing, and covering, things people have done for generations. I'm not saying this is the only way to build a shelter. I am saying this is one way that works, that costs very little, and that you can start this weekend if you have the land and the tools. The companies that sell expensive bunkers are not lying about their products. They are just not telling you that the protection comes from the earth, not from what they sold you. This is how it used to be done. It still works the same way today.